Welcome back to the Thermo podcast. I'm your host, Jayton Miller, and today I have on the podcast again, Mr. Keith Littlewood. So the first episode that I had with Keith was one of my favorite of the history of the Thermo podcast, and I'm super excited for y'all to listen to this episode today. We talk about things from how estrogen and cortisol affect the thyroid, the diurnal rhythm of the thyroid, vitamin A, thyroid carrier proteins, methylene blue and its relationship to higher thyroid hormone availability, the largest factors in maintaining a healthy thyroid, and Keith's functional endocrinology and nutrition seminars. So I'm really looking forward to y'all being able to listen to this one. It's filled with an extreme amount of value. So let's get into it. How's it going today, guys? I am here with Keith Littlewood. How you doing today, Keith?
Not bad. Traded the heat of Dubai for the cold and snow of the Lake District in England. So enjoying the shift, to be honest.
Definitely. So this is your second appearance on the Thermo podcast. I really appreciate your time and thank you for hopping on here and talking to me with me again. For those who haven't listened to your previous podcast, could you kind of tell them your background and how you came across this realm of health?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I fell into kind of health by just starting out as a gym instructor and then as a personal trainer, and then into kind of having my own health club and small personal training company. And then I realized I hated managing people. And then I did some kind of holistic kind of exercise stuff in the US with the Czech Institute. And then I kind of moved away from that and got into functional medicine testing, and then kind of more into kind of Ray Peat's work, which I found really interesting, in the science that he kind of referenced, be it Albert St. Georgi or Hans Selye or Katharina Dalton, some really good scientists with some really credible work behind them. And that kind of spurred me on to kind of challenge my biases. I thought it's all very good reading these books, which are absolutely astounding books, but I decided to go to uni and back to uni. I did a degree in fitness and health, which was really just plodding along, not really meaning anything at the time. But I did a postgrad and a master's degree in endocrinology, looking at kind of specifically, it was interesting because the experience of understanding what doctors are studying as well, because there are mainly doctors on the course, and seeing how they kind of look at different aspects of research and, perhaps shy away from the nutritional aspects and, often take the dogmatic beliefs that the blood tests are the gold standard. So it's interesting to really study with them. But my master's degree was looking at perhaps looking at some of the older research like Broder Barnes put out, and did a small study looking at body temperature and pulse and how blood thyroid values like thyroid stimulating hormone can appear completely normal, but yet people can have a suboptimal temperature and have all this clinical presentation of low thyroid function. So it was just kind of along those lines. And I'm just starting my PhD next year, which is kind of a real challenge for me because I thought I wasn't capable of doing the other studies, but it's kind of a lot more in depth and going into more some clinical research and looking at thyroid receptor expression, looking at liver function when the body's perhaps certainly not human bodies, but rodent physiology, when they're exposed to multiple pollutants at various levels. So the idea is to go and do that. So that's kind of been my journey over the last, from the fitness industry in the late 90s, up until now. And I'm here now kind of doing this thing, working primarily earning money as a kind of coach for kind of hormone related issues like digestion, sleep, energy, mood, fertility, that kind of thing. And trying to juggle being a parent and working and studying at the same time. So it's all a bit of a juggle, but here I am.
Definitely. That's awesome. Well, I know that I thoroughly enjoy your work. You're probably one of the more knowledgeable people that I've come across, other than Georgie Dinkoff and Ray himself. So I really appreciate everything that you're putting out for everybody. It's awesome.
Hey, I really appreciate it. I mean, to be honest, it's like that you're talking about very, very clever guys there. But I just generally, I have probably 20 years on most people. I'm 49, so I've read a lot more books and kind of juggled around. So most people should be where I am at that age, I think. So, but it's nice to be kind of considered within those kind of work of people. But they're very, very clever people for sure.
Definitely. So whenever it comes to thyroid, how do estrogen and cortisol, and I guess stress in general, kind of affect the thyroid's functioning?
Yeah, I mean there are multiple levels. Even from the basic kind of skipping meals, where we know that kind of cortisol is going to need to be produced primarily if there's not enough energy around. The body has to start breaking down fats as a fuel. If glucose is running out, the brain is preferentially going to ensure that the liver's saving some liver for the brain. The brain likes to use glucose, so if it gets to start breaking down fatty acids as a fuel chronically, it's a bit of a problem. So initially the thing of just skipping meals, which people should be able to do if they have a healthy physiology, but a lot of people don't. And the ability to skip meals is one of the primary reasons why they can't cope. If you're training in a fasted state, for example, you're going to be starting to produce a lot more cortisol, and that has an effect. We know that the glucocorticoids, cortisol, and even adrenaline, for example, have the capacity to inhibit thyroid, primarily because it's a bit like analogous to the digestive system, right? When you're kind of not in the parasympathetic state of kind of digesting foods, and you're kind of startled and you have to spring into action, the digestive system shuts down and you start funneling blood towards the working organs, the periphery, the skin, just to get you prepared for that stressor. And that's the same thing, is that when you have these kind of higher levels of adrenaline and cortisol, it's really there to get you out of a situation, and that comes at a cost by inhibiting the organizational hormones like thyroid. And what you might tend to see in the acute stage is perhaps a slight increase in TSH, but it's usually kind of inhibited very, very quickly. And when you look at kind of medical cases where people have been using long-term corticosteroids or something, for example, then thyroid physiology is certainly suppressed. And sometimes TSH is unreadable in that state. And this is why we kind of tend to see a lot of thyroid blood tests appear completely normal. And I think that's relatively problematic, because I've been working with a lot of clients in Australia recently, and there's this dogmatic kind of upholdance of the TSH being the gold standard. So I see a lot of clients that I've been to the doctors and they've looked at my TSH and they won't look at the T4 or T3 or the free T4s and T3 as a marker, because they think that that's the gold standard test. And I think that's the problem. There are many things that can make thyroid blood tests appear completely normal, and being stressed and cortisol production is just one of those, as an example. Whether you're training in a fasted state or chronic emotional stressors, chronic pollutant stressors, perhaps you're over exercising, perhaps there are a number of stresses that can drive that. But that's just one of the reasons why cortisol might be elevated, but at the same time TSH might be suppressed. And in a normal healthy system, what you should see is that as TSH starts to increase, you'll generally see cortisol increase as part of that. But you'll tend to see a lot of people don't have that normal response. And this is why perhaps the feedback mechanisms with the loops of, that there being enough thyroid hormone within the blood and in the carrier proteins, which we'll talk about later, going back to the pituitary and that feedback mechanism going, there's enough thyroid in the blood, we don't need to produce anymore. We don't need to ramp up TSH production. And so TSH production, as I said, usually what would happen is cortisol would increase, because TSH in itself, for example, it's a stress hormone. Not everybody tends to kind of view it as that, but when you have high production of TSH, it's associated with fibrosis. It's associated with follicle hyperplasia within the thyroid gland itself. So TSH can be as much a stressor as, say, cortisol and the effects of estrogen, which we'll talk about in a minute. And also the TSH receptor, which can be problematic as well. The TSH receptor, it's not just in the thyroid gland, it's in the ovaries, in the testicles, in the liver, in the bone. And there are various reasons that when the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor is upregulated, there are kind of connotations with this, and it's kind of progression with tumors and cancers. So there's kind of a knock-on effect of perhaps understanding why TSH should start to increase in response to a lack of peripheral conversion of thyroid hormones, understanding that there are mechanisms that can inhibit it as well. So that's why TSH perhaps on its own can be a complete waste of time.
Yeah, definitely. So whenever it comes to the TSH receptors, especially within the reproductive tissue, do you know exactly what's kind of going on there?
No, I don't. I think I'm still kind of working my way through that as part of my studies, but I think it's that it might be as part of the mechanism with the extra peripheral thyroid issue. Maybe it's having an effect for um, that's slightly problematic. That's perhaps related to growth.
Hmm.
There may be some synergy with some of the other tissues that are associated with growth in cancers as well. Perhaps like the endothelial growth factors that you tend to see with angiogenesis and other factors of growth. So maybe it's to do with growth and proliferation, much like the estrogenic issues that you tend to see. But I'd put my hand up and say I don't fully know at this moment in time.
Definitely. So whenever it comes to estrogen, do you usually notice that it is estrogen then high TSH levels from the suppression of the thyroid, or that it's in the reverse?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
So whenever it comes to estrogen and its effect on thyroid, do you usually notice that estrogen inhibits the thyroid function and then TSH goes up, or the other way around?
I think it's hard to say with that sometimes. I mean, estrogen does have the capacity to inhibit thyroid hormone production. It can kind of affect the thyroid binding globulin and to a degree maybe even transthyretin. But sometimes when estrogen is produced, it will suppress thyroid physiology. And I think even to a certain extent, you could argue, and I've seen this with some female clients, is that they're pushed into a subclinical low a subclinical state of hypothyroidism, even on the build-up of in their premenstrual phase, for example. You'll have a dump of estrogen. It will have effects on stimulating glycolysis. It can have an effect on lowering thyroid physiology. So I generally think it's the estrogens increasing that suppress the thyroid. But equally, you could be low thyroid from a number of different reasons, perhaps environmental pollutants, and stressors that might then allow estrogen to have a double whammy effect, as it were. So thyroid is being suppressed, and then you have an excess of estrogen, which suppresses thyroid physiology further, and that has knock-on effects because it can affect liver, and excess of estrogen can affect all levels of aerobic physiology, the electron transport chain. And so therefore it can have negative effects to oxidative phosphorylation and use of fats and glucose as a fuel efficiently. So I think it's going to be probably context specific to the person and what they're experiencing, but generally as a rule of thumb, estrogen will suppress thyroid physiology. Does that answer the question?
Definitely, it did.
Yeah.
Yes. So whenever it comes to like the functioning of the thyroid, I know that TSH is usually highest during the night. Is there like an overall diurnal rhythm of thyroid performance?
Well, I think you could probably look at it as similar to the seasonal effects of. I think the diet, or certainly the kind of the nadir of TSH at night time, perhaps parallels that need of just if you take a single day and then look at it as a seasonal thing. We know that TSH is usually at its lowest in the summer months, and then perhaps starts to increase during the winter months. Why? Because there's less light around, as an example. Therefore, well, there are many aspects to that. The fact that there's not enough light around, we often see less hormones being. Sorry, when there's enough light around, there's enough hormones being converted. But as it gets colder, we know there are things that we know our body needs to generate more heat, for example. Whereas in summertime, we're kind of being warmed up by the sun and the environment around us. So that will mean that TSH will start to increase as days get darker and longer, as opposed to lighter and longer. And so, there are other aspects like increasing serotonin and increasing melatonin as well that might have an impact on that during the winter months as well. But going back to the question regarding nighttime, I think the TSH is paralleling that kind of darkness, the stress of darkness that Ray Peat who was the first person to kind of suggest that for me, which I found really interesting, is that as darkness onsets, and you'll have peak of melatonin, which in itself perhaps suppresses thyroid to a degree. It cools the body down, You'll have increases in growth hormone. And again, depending on someone's physiology, how well they're fed, how much they've eaten, will probably dictate how much growth hormone is being produced, as an example, how much cortisol is being produced, and ultimately how much TSH is being produced at night time. So I think the standard day just is just an expression of the stress induced by darkness to a degree.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so one question that I've had for quite a while is I've always thought that vitamin A, especially in excess, hinders proper thyroid functioning. And I know it depends on the carotenoid versus the animal derivatives. What is your take on vitamin A? Is it something that we should supplement with if we don't get enough in our diet, or is it just something that we should avoid completely?
Well, I think there are a couple of contexts to that, and I have seen some of the controversial. I've skimmed over some of the controversial posts in coming out of the US from some people who say that you shouldn't be taking vitamin A. I think that there's tends to be a glossing over of some of the real problems in the US, and I think there is a substantially large portion of hypothyroid people. Now, bearing in mind, if you start throwing plenty of vitamin A at someone who's low thyroid, your ability to use that vitamin A is substantially diminished. Therefore, you are likely to become, consume toxic levels, or kind of perhaps slightly excessive levels of vitamin A quite easily. It's well known, as you said, that the beta carotenoids tend to not be as favorable as, say, the preformed vitamin A, which comes from your kind of organ meats, livers, that kind of thing, which I think is an essential component of the diet. And I think the more stress that you're under, I think the more sunshine that you're in, I think that how sick you get will dictate how much vitamin A that you need. And I can't see any reason why people couldn't consume 20 to 30 grams of liver a day, or maybe 5 to 6 days a week, as useful. I certainly, you can look for those telltale signs of consuming the excess carotenoids, and you see your kind of keratosis, and these orangey fat pads in the hands, and sometimes on your feet. When I used to do lots of physical therapy, I could tell when someone had been on a paleo type diet, consuming loads of sweet potatoes and squash, because their feet would be virtually orange. And I'd say, do you eat lots of sweet potatoes? They say, yeah, every day. And it's like, you can see these things. But I do think it's really important to understand whether someone's liver is functional enough to utilize the vitamin A. And would always favor kind of more of the kind of liver from that. Not to say squashes and sweet potatoes aren't useful foods, because they can be, but they're when you're eating them every day, the excess of the carotenoids can have an effect on making the liver slightly more sluggish than it could be, and therefore you need to consider that. But when someone's sick, as I was saying, you can become sick very, very, well, it depends how sick you can be. It might be an acute or in a chronic illness, but you will deplete vitamin A substantially. So if you're someone who gets sick quite a lot throughout the year, you might find that liver being the game changer. And I do find that organ meats, and particularly liver, is something that does have a big bang effect for a lot of people, particularly female clients, because it will assist with hormone conversion. For example, in the female cycle, the corpus luteum holds a substantial amount of vitamin A that I think it helps to produce the progesterone from. So, if you're looking at kind of ovulatory issues and fertility issues, then getting adequate amounts of vitamin A could be essential. I know a friend of mine that's consumed 30 grams of raw liver every day for the last 10 years and is one of the healthiest people I know.
So I've seen a study where they took adolescent boys who hit puberty late, and so they hadn't hit it yet, and they actually supplemented with vitamin A plus iron, and it had similar effects to bioidentical testosterone within the study. So as far as like the synthesis of the steroid hormones, how does vitamin A play a role in that?
Um, It's funny because I've seen a similar study as well with menopausal women who have had similar issues, and supplementing with vitamin A has basically taken away some of their post-menopausal symptoms. Which was really interesting. So I think with vitamin A, it allows the liver to function efficiently. It will help with steroid or hormone conversion. It will help with tissue differentiation, which is quite important. If you look at the issues, say, for example, with people who've been in the sun a lot and they're exposed to excess UV, one of the primary actions of vitamin A is just acting as a tissue differentiator, and it will just promote steroidal hormone in the peripheral tissues and in the liver. Generally, as a rule of thumb, that's the mechanisms I'm aware of vitamin A, and I don't know the exact mechanisms beyond that. The other thing as well as with vitamin A is that generally you might see, particularly many females again, coming up as anemic. And it's a low vitamin A status that's not allowing binding of iron efficiently, not allowing hemoglobin production efficiently. So it tends to have a knock-on effect to other systems related to kind of red blood cell production as well. So it's not just limited to steroidal conversion.
So do you think that people who are anemic on blood tests should probably start supplementing with vitamin A initially instead of going towards iron as supplementation?
Absolutely, and to a degree as well. If you look at, say, you can get a feel from some of the RBC tests, like hemoglobin, hematocrit, mean corpuscular volume, and those ones may actually flag up as slightly low. So if they're kind of end range low or even low, you can probably suggest someone's a hypothyroid first of all, and you'll probably find that adequate vitamin A and restoring thyroid capacity will basically eradicate the what looks like anemia. But again, if you're just getting a blood test done that's just looking at, say, serum iron levels, and you're not looking at ferritin, transferritin, or tissue iron binding capacity, then you still get a lot of doctors that will look at just iron levels and go, hey, you're anemic. And it's like, well, why aren't they responding to the iron when you give them loads of iron? I've seen people have IV iron drips and wondering why they feel pretty crappy for just supplementing extra iron. And it still makes me wonder how people can have 5 years of medical training and usually a specialism and get to that point where they're just looking at a single blood test and wondering why iron's not increasing. So yeah, it's to answer the question, I think, if someone has the context, their history is there, they're perhaps not eating enough iron meats, they're under a lot of stress, perhaps they get a lot of sunshine, all of these reasons, but perhaps they've been sick multiple times throughout the year, that would be a good indication of needing for that. And many females, as an example, tend to shy away from organ meats anyway. I often get emails from clients saying, I can't stomach liver, what's the next best thing? And unfortunately, the next best thing is liver tablets, because there's no getting around it sometimes. That's the next best thing.
Definitely. So whenever it comes to liver tablets, I've heard that some of the nutrients can be oxidized inside of them. Do you still think that there's a significant benefit from supplementing with them?
Yeah, no, I mean, it does depend. If substances have been oxidized, then that there may not be as good a benefit. So it's something that needs to be considered on the supplement to see if the nutrients are still there, for sure.
Definitely. So you had mentioned them earlier, but what are some of the ways that we can increase the efficacy of the carrier proteins for thyroid hormones? And what are some of the ones that we can keep an eye on?
Well, there are three main carrier proteins for the thyroid as such, which is transthyretin, thyroid binding globulin, and albumin. I think it's becoming part of the problem. Certainly, I've spent the last few weeks researching pollutants as part of a literature review, and it's problematic because in rodents, the main carrier protein is transthyretin, and you've got a lot of research on that. Rodents tend to have the major human one, which is thyroid binding globulin. But transthyretin is another one that's quite problematic, because I think it's about 30-40% of the thyroid carrier capacity, maybe 30%. I think thyroid binding globulins that probably got the majority of it. But they can be easily displaced. So, for example, unsaturated fatty acids can displace thyroid hormone from transthyretin. Transthyretin tends to have a capacity for retinoid binding protein, which is your vitamin A type protein, and then T4. Now, it's very easy for PUFAs like fish oils, DHA, to hijack that carrier protein. And so other pollutants like PCBs and perhaps phthalates can also do that as well. And they're very ubiquitous in the environment. So, when we start to see these carrier proteins being hijacked, perhaps it's one of the reasons why thyroid hormones are problematic when you come to look at a blood test. So if you, for example, you have full carriers, then it seems in the blood that there might actually be enough T4 and T3. And so this is where perhaps these feedback mechanisms become compromised. So I think understanding that there are a number of things that can hijack the thyroid proteins. I'm just trying to think of practical ways of doing this. I think just maintaining, the euthyroid status of having good thyroid function, and I think vitamin A will play a part in that as well, because it probably has a beneficial effect on transthyretin as well. So I think just trying to, it's virtually impossible these days to avoid pollution and to avoid I just put the word toxins, but they are real and they are ubiquitous, and they do have discernible and very nefarious effects on thyroid physiology. So you can't avoid them. You can do things like at your home, make sure you've got kind of clean water coming in. At the moment, I live in one of the most polluted cities in the world, and we have, an air filter upstairs and downstairs to deal with the air in the house. So I think there are things that you can do to perhaps create your own cocoon and make sure that you're limiting the exposure to pollutants, and that includes cleaning pollutants. Perhaps the cleansing products that you use and grooming products that you use. All of those can perhaps have a cumulative effect. So if you live in a polluted city, you're drinking heavily fluoridated water, you come home, you're spraying Mr. Muscle or whatever, everything, your Jif, and you're kind of breathing a lot of these things. There is perhaps a risk and a cumulative factor that's probably hard to analyze in any shape or form, but maybe that factor that pushes it over. And these can have an effect on the carrier proteins and how they are transporting thyroid hormones. So I think taking care of your own environment that you spend time to sleep in and regenerate in is very, very important. And also getting out to environments that don't have these kind of ubiquitous air pollutants. Some of the pollutants that we find in air have very estrogenic qualities that are very problematic to physiology, and can also have an effect of kind of hijacking not just the carrier proteins but also the receptors as well, and exert negative actions around how T3 is taken into the cell. So there are problems. So the more that you can manage your environment at home, and the more that you can get out to areas that are kind of rich in nature, clean air, perhaps have a different vibration or kind of feel to them when you step out there. I know, being in the countryside at the moment, I feel very much more relaxed, although I'm looking after the kids all day long, and there's a few things to juggle up there. But being in the country with clean air, I often feel much more relaxed than I do in a city that's kind of heavy in the air with pollutants, and has a certain stressful feel to it.
Definitely. I think some of that also has to do with like sound pollution too, because we're not always aware of the amount of sound that's coming in subconsciously that is just keeping us kind of stressed out without us
No,
even knowing.
absolutely. Yeah. It's I live near relatively near a busy road in the Middle East, and here it's kind of, there's a road outside, but there's a lake on the other side of the mountains, and it's literally the noises, apart from the odd goose flying past, it's pretty quiet. But yeah, I think that the carrier proteins, another interesting point is the unsaturated fatty acids. And to a degree, even saturated fatty acids, when they're very, very excessive, perhaps you're consuming an excess amount of saturated fats, can have a similar effect. But the affinity for carrier proteins like thyroid binding globulin and transthyretin, the unsaturated fatty acids have a very high affinity for it. So like the brominated flame retardants, which are again the most ubiquitous pollutants that are around, and you tend to find them in offices, warehouses, where people work, in the dust and in the air. And then you have all the other PCBs and phthalates, and the PHAHs as well. All of these seem to have a very negative effect on how thyroid hormones are both carried and how they cross perhaps the blood-brain barrier.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have other transport mechanisms called the monocarboxylate transporters 8 and 10, and something called the OAT1C1, which is the organic anion transport proteins. And these are kind of thyroid carrying proteins. OAT, for example, is something that carries the thyroid across the blood-brain barrier into the central nervous system, and is found quite heavily in the pituitary. And these can also be affected by pollutants as well. The MCT10 is kind of more in muscle tissue and other kind of organs as well. But these kind of small cellular kind of proteins and transporters can also be affected by pollutants as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So you were actually the first one that I found that actually talked about methylene blue and it increasing thyroid hormone availability. Can you kind of go into how that works a little bit?
Sure. It's funny you should say that, because I've been thinking about this recently, because I thought I don't have the true answer to it. Is that what does appear quite a feature, certainly in rodent physiology, is that there's more thyroid hormone availability in the serum post methylene blue. Now, at the moment, I'm not too sure whether that's actually means that there's less need for thyroid hormone because perhaps oxidative phosphorylation is enhanced. Perhaps fatty acid and glucose oxidation is utilized efficiently. So I don't know if that higher serum thyroid value is a product of more efficient function and less thyroid need, or something else. So I'm not quite sure at the moment. I was just thinking about this recently, of whether that how that was a positive feature for the thyroid at the moment. So my thoughts on it at the moment are that because oxidative metabolism is functioning as efficiently as it can do, it's probably producing adequate carbon dioxide. Cytochrome C is functioning well. Perhaps the need for thyroid is lessened somewhat, and that's why you might see slightly more thyroid hormone available in the blood. Or it might be that it's affecting other structures and there's generally more thyroid hormone available because the system has become more efficient. I mean, typically when you use methylene blue, it tends to go to problem areas anyway. In cancer physiologists will tend to use it as a kind of detection system, right? They inject methylene blue intravenously or perhaps into sites of tumors, and you'll often see that the methylene blue would kind of aggregate in these areas and can be picked up with certain imaging, and I think that's very, very useful. It was interesting, I was speaking to a relative who's a doctor, and they kind of thought I was balmy about talking about methylene blue for restoring physiology, and they said we just used it for kind of looking at cancers within the body, and I was like, well, doesn't it tell you something that it's aggregating there? Why is it aggregating there? Is it aggregating for a reason? Is the effect beneficial for physiology? And I think it's still kind of quite balmy that I find I was doing a course last year, earlier on in the year, on basics of cancer physiology, and they were just throwing in, an emerging feature of cancer physiology is altered metabolism. I'm like, well, they knew that 70 or 80 years ago. That was the Warburg effect, that that cells tend to rapidly kind of dwindle towards glycolysis and burn everything up inefficiently. So how, as oncologists and cancer specialists, talking about altered metabolism as an emerging feature of cancer physiology, especially when they're using methylene blue, which has the capacity to kind of, ensure that the electron transport chain and aerobic metabolism is restored efficiently. So to answer the question, I still don't know exactly, but perhaps it's just a suggestion that the system's more efficient and ultimately there's more thyroid hormone available. I might have a different answer for that in a few months.
Definitely. I have kind of like two questions, one thyroid and one cancer related. As far as like the cancer goes, do you think that it aggregates there because of the reductive state of the tumors? And I've also heard one of my friends told me about a podcast with Ray and Georgie where they were talking about whenever they injected the tumors with methylene blue and then exposed them to a certain wavelength of light, it actually helped shrink the tumors.
Yeah, I mean, yes. To answer your question, I think it does aggregate there because it is going towards the reductive metabolism. I think it's kind of because glycolysis is there. I don't know why it aggregates there. I mean, what would be the reason why how it would go there? Why? I mean, that would be the question to answer that. How does the body drive it there? Or what? How does it aggregate there? I don't know the answer to that. So maybe someone with more brains than me can perhaps answer that. But it's interesting to know that it does aggregate there, and it does have the capacity to increase oxidative metabolism. And yeah, there are quite a few studies that show that when you kind of use a red light spectrum, I think it's anywhere in the standard kind of red light spectrum, perhaps 630 up to about 830 or something like that, 650 to 830, have shown very beneficial things, not just on reducing cancer or tumor size, which can be done with perhaps a number of things, but I think its effects on kind of blood parasites and malaria seem to work much more beneficially when you have methylene blue shared with a red light spectrum. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense that if the tumor is kind of running out of control, the microenvironment is kind of very acidic, it's wasting glucose. Perhaps it's one of the hallmarks of cancer, tumor and progression is the breakdown of fatty acids and the gene expression of something called the PPARs. And this is well known within cancer physiology, is that kind of that kind of altered aggressive wasting state, and why people tend to say, oh, sugar tends to feed cancer. Well, sugar will feed any cell that's functioning well, but ultimately glucose is the easiest source. When you don't have that, you aggressively break down fatty acids. Now, if you keep breaking down fatty acids, particularly unsaturated fatty acids, you're going to keep getting damage to the electron transport chain. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle where there's chronic glycolysis and no chance of getting out of that. So I think it makes perfect sense that red light is being used in conjunction with methylene blue to get the beneficial effects for cancer. Definitely.
Yeah. And then as far as like for thyroid performance, do you think that it could do with an increased amount of ATP production that it's just a higher output of thyroid hormone?
Yeah, it's possible. And again, it would be kind of tissue specific, right? So if there is enhanced oxidative phosphorylation and there's adequate ATP, perhaps it's even part of the component of carbon dioxide as well, becomes a self-regulating feature of the metabolism. So certainly having more energy around and more ATP around is going to be useful. I think when you're kind of not breaking down the aerobic metabolism and pushing someone towards glycolysis, you have more ATP around anyway, right? So it would make sense that if there's more ATP, generally most cells can function efficiently, and that includes peripheral conversion of thyroid hormone.
Definitely. So I guess as kind of like summing all of that up, what do you think are the top 5 tips that we can do today to help get our thyroid on track and increase its effectiveness?
Well, I still do think that eating on a regular basis is one of the easiest things that we can do to maintain thyroid function. I've seen it time and time again. I've seen people who perhaps think a low thyroid based upon all of their symptoms, and surprisingly, I've seen them actually, do wonderful things and not be hypothyroid. They just needed a good, solid source of nutrients coming in, each day. Interestingly enough, I was working with a lady just the last couple of months who was diagnosed with premature ovarian failure. She was like 42, 43, and told she'd basically gone into menopause, and within the space of 4 weeks and some supplemental progesterone, she started having her period again. So the context to thyroid extends to the other hormones, reproductive hormones as well. So I think eating on a regular basis is very, very important. I think getting adequate light is also essential. And we kind of take it back to what we talked about with the long days of summer. Generally, mammals produce less TSH because the need to heat the body up, the need to kind of maintain metabolism can be to a degree propped up during warm days of sunshine. Not to say that somebody might mistakenly be propped up by that, but then you might start to see that as the lightness starts to fade and the days get longer, their true hypothyroid state might be actually expressed. And this is why people get seasonal affective disorder and, mood related issues in the winter. You can spot that. So I think adequate food, adequate light. I certainly think not over good doing. I think exercise is generally, you should be doing exercise up until you can't exercise anymore, because it has an anabolic effect. It helps us to kind of feel stronger. I put my back out the other day just from a long flight and 6 hours of driving to get to the place I was going to, and I felt an old injury that usually puts me on my back in tears if I don't manage it. And I literally got on top of it, did the exercises 3 times a day, and I was out of pain. So understanding that movement and staying strong can help to promote optimal function of the body. And the more that we can kind of, deal with the stresses of whether it's taking the heavy bags of shopping and lifting our kids up and stuff and not being in pain, pain has an effect on thyroid physiology, because the more chronic pain we're in, more chronic cortisol and adrenaline we produce, and we start wasting vitamin C and other nutrients that can have an effect and ultimately stress the thyroid out as well. So I think staying fit and healthy is important, but then not overdoing exercise is an essential feature. If you want to stay strong, good strength program 3 times a week is going to set you up. Walking every day, and experiencing the stress reduction effects of walking as well can be particularly useful. If you're into your long distance aerobic work, whatever floats your boat, whatever boosts your rocket. But if you look at, say, long distance running as an example, they're much more prone to coronary artery calcification, which tends to have a spillover with kind of aspects of thyroid function as well. I mean, that might have interactions with nutrient availability as well, but generally that the longer distance, the more calcified arteries that people tend to have. So that probably has an effect on thyroid physiology. I know we're on number 4, but I'm going to say this one now because it's the most prominent thing. I do think if you're not eating thyroid-rich foods, and you've done all you can from a metabolic perspective to enhance your nutrient uptake, available energy, getting adequate carbs in, good quality proteins and fats, and you're not getting it there, you don't have a waking temperature of 36.5 degrees or about 97.8, progressing to 37 or 98.6, then there's a very good likelihood of you requiring thyroid hormone. And I don't take it lightly when I say that there are probably hundreds of millions of people out there that aren't. So I think understanding that and exploring, experimenting with what's missing is the key thing to enhancing physiology and making people more robust. And ultimately, people having good thyroid function extends to more people thinking about the world around them and what stuff's going on and how they can change it. Because I think a lot of people just go day to day without having the capacity to think, because they're so stressed out by the regular daily things, whether it's kind of emotions or whether it's kind of dealing with stresses from a relationship or kind of finances or the environment. All of these things tend to not be dealt with efficiently when you're in a low thyroid state. So I think if we can raise the energy and thought processes of large amounts of the population, perhaps the world might start to push towards a better place. That's just me living perhaps in a utopian dream that's modified by thyroid hormone. But I do think it's certainly a feature that we need to think about.
Definitely. I completely agree. I think that the relationship between thyroid functioning and our psychology is absolutely, it's completely undervalued for one, but it's just mind-boggling how much of an impact that it can make, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But so you have a functional endocrinology and nutrition set of seminars. I would love to hear more about this and how people can get involved in that.
Sure. So I kind of started just over a year ago, just putting together seminars, which has kind of been basic my experience of studying endocrinology, kind of looking at some really great scientists' work like Ray's stuff and Katharina Dalton's stuff, and it's really just kind of seminars on kind of looking at hormones in a way that I think is slightly more beneficial, well, much more beneficial than seeing skilled clinicians sometimes, who perhaps just rigidly look at the blood tests. So it's really about understanding, some of the basics between the hypothalamus pituitary relationships, understanding feedback mechanisms, looking at aspects of cardiac function and why the staircase effect is useful for understanding why someone's heart rate and temperature give us a really good kind of overview of someone's health. So it's looking at these kind of client testing tools. And ultimately my main motivation is kind of, I've gone through this. I went through, spending a lot of money and kind of getting clients to spend a lot of money on testing. I used to do hundreds of stool tests a year, and I've kind of come to the conclusion now that you don't really need to put people through lots of tests. And I'll get a lot of clients coming to me and saying, what blood tests do you want? I go, I don't want any. I said, we'll start using blood tests, when we've got you to a state where those tests might mean something because you're not in a stressed state. And B, let's use them if what I'm suggesting doesn't work. So I think testing should be the end range. If you're not sorting out someone's nutrition, lifestyle, factors of light, carbon dioxide, all of these things, then these are the tools that you can give to people to kind of work with clients to get them functioning without spending lots of money. So it's an overview of kind of like, adrenal hormones in context. There's neurobiology of sleep and how to change someone's sleep, looking at the kind of why people wake up at night, how to resolve the midnight pee. There's seminars on resolving premenstrual syndrome. There's seminars on cholesterol and coronary artery calcification. There's some on the membrane theory and trying to incorporate the standard stuff of why people say you need to have fish oils for a liquid membrane, which kind of is a bit mental when you think about it, especially when you understand how the lipid bilayer doesn't actually go around the whole cell, and also how when you oxidize these fatty acids, it causes many, many problems. So it's kind of trying to incorporate Gilbert Ling's work, which I still don't understand. I've just kind of put some brief things that kind of look at perhaps bringing some of it together. There's some stuff on what else is in there. I can't even remember right now. There's some biology of cancer seminars. There's about 21 seminars in there at the moment, including breathing pattern physiology, carbon dioxide retention. And the seminars range from about 30 minutes up to about 90 minutes. And the idea is I add a new one every couple of months for the members, just to get an idea of kind of what I'm looking at, what I think is important to kind of critique and perhaps put out there against people who are saying, why statins are really, really useful for longevity, when it appears that they actually increase the risk of coronary artery calcification and break down the electron transport chain and create more oxidative stress over time. So it's really about contrasting some of the well-known things that are out there and looking at some of the things that I've learned and just giving a slightly different slant on hormones and nutrition in the environment. So that's what I keep trying to add to it. It was something that adds to those conversations.
Definitely. Do you have any, where can people find that?
That's on my website, and it's just under the functional endocrinology and nutrition page, which I'm thinking of changing soon to just functional hormones and nutrition, because still a lot of people don't understand or know what endocrinology is. So I think people understand what hormones are. So I'm probably going to change the name on that.
Sounds good. And that's at balancedbodyminds.com.
Yeah, that's it. It's just on one of the main pages there, and I appreciate you advertising it. Thank you.
Definitely. And then your Instagram is Tomo Littlewood.
Yeah.
Do you have any other social media platforms that you like to use?
No, I have a Facebook page, which is Balanced Body Mind, but it's not used that much these days. It tends to be Instagram and the website. And I probably need to think about another social media thing, because they're always changing. But I kind of I only do them because I need to kind of get clients in. So I need to think of another a platform. But I'm certainly not going down the route of TikTok. That's for sure.
Definitely, yeah. I'll be staying away from that as well.
Yeah.
But Keith, again, I appreciate you hopping on here, and I know these listeners are going to love it.
I know. I really appreciate it. Could I just add one more thing to be cheeky?
Absolutely.
If anybody's interested, there is a link on my website, which is for my PhD. My PhD is costing me tens of thousands of pounds, probably close to £50,000. So I've put up a GoFundMe page, which is going nicely. I've raised nearly £5,000 so far. I'm not expecting all of it. I will be paying a substantial amount towards it, but the lab fees are costing me over £30,000 for the experiment. So independent science isn't cheap. So if anybody feels like dropping $5 or $10 down or anything, that would be really appreciated, because I've got the next 6 years to try and work with that. So if even if they can't afford to do that, just sharing it with people that want to see some independent science done.
Definitely. And what's the GoFundMe under?
That's a great question. I know it's like, if you go on my website, there's actually a link on there. It's I can't remember without shutting this down and deleting the screen and you going. So it's on my website, and there's also a link in my link tree in Instagram.
Sounds good. Yeah, for all those you listening, make sure to check that out. Please share it. I know I'm going to as soon as this podcast is over. So definitely.
Yeah, it was really great to talk to you again. Happy to chat again, but good to see you, Jayton. Thanks a lot.
Yes, sir. It's good seeing you. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you want us to cover a different topic.